But so welcome to a new Masechta. This is Masechet
Yay.
Chullin. And for those who found some people reported to him Menachot was a little challenging for them. I'm going to say Chullin is not so easy because the concepts and the terminology is not so easy, meaning we're going to have large segments that talk about body parts of animals. And I'm going to do my best with the English I have, but I did not grow up on a farm. And so I have to admit that some of these things are very foreign to me. And although I have learned some anatomy in my life, so that helps me, the Gemara's anatomy and the medical anatomy is not always the same, right? So,
We need a veterinarian to be part of this.
yeah, and they have books. I don't know if anyone has one. I have one on my shelf from like years ago. They're probably better ones now in the art scroll and the Koran and everything, where they have like really graphic pictures of different body. And we'll get there. The different stomachs of the cow and the different trephot and the different tendons and things like that. Like there's a lot of details. But because we talk about treifot, right? A big topic of chulin is what animals are kosher, and unlike kudshim and zvachim and menachot for the most part, where intention matters, right? Here, intention matters much less. It's action that matters. Intention matters a little bit. And we'll get there, but it's really, what are the facts? What is the animal? Is it a treifa? What wound? How quickly do you do shchita? And so we'll get to all of that. Good to see you, Robert. Mazal tov on for if those finished menachot. We're about to start the new Masecha of Masechet Chullin, which also very interestingly fits into Seder Kodshim, even though it's called Chullin, right? So we will see a lot of parallels in sort of differences and similarities between how we treat meat that's civilian meat, I'll call it, and meat from the Beit HaMikdash. So says our first Mishnah, Hakol Shochatin, Daf Bet. Everyone is allowed to do shchita on a regular animal, meaning shchita is a process of killing an animal in a certain way, which we'll learn that way. Everyone can do it, and everyone presumably includes men and women. We talked about that a little bit today. Kohanim, Yisraelim, Avadim, maybe. So all people. And so we'll see more in the Gemara, of course. Ushchitatan kshera, and those who do shchita is kosher, which we're going to ask immediately seems like a contradiction because it implies something b'diavad. If you do it, it's okay, even though it just said you can do it. Chutz, says the Mishnah, except for cheresh shotav v'katan, except for people we generally consider not to have dat, not to have awareness and knowledge of what they're doing. So a cherish, which was a deaf person who in those days there was no way to educate or communicate, and so they couldn't understand things. A shoteh, who's someone with, I guess we would call, either mental disorders or low IQ, and a katan, a child. And those people cannot do shchita. Shema yikalkalu et shchitatam. They might mess up the shchita. So shchita is a mechanical thing, but you need to have intention, not for necessarily for a machshava, for a thought, but for actual the action, and those people cannot do it. But everyone who does shchita, now we don't know who everyone is, and we'll see that in a minute, who does shchita and others see them and vouch that they did it properly, that's okay. So there's something called hashgacha, and we're going to, obviously, it's a big life question about hashgacha. We're going to get there in the Gemara. Says
So
the
I know we're going to get to this, but this doesn't even exclude a non-Jew.
Correct, 100% not. Correct.
Okay.
We're going to get to it. But you're correct. Says the Gemara, Kol shochatin. Now that implies lechatchila. That implies that everyone can do shchita, meaning there's no limitation. It's not like ideally, 50-year-old Kohanim should do shchita, but everyone else is okay. Everyone can do shchita. That's the chatchila. But then it says shchitatan kshira, that if they do shchita, it's kosher, which implies diavad. So that's a question mark. That's a contradiction in our Mishnah. Now, that's the Gemara saying that. Says Rav Acha Brei de Rava Rav Ashi, Amli Rav Acha Brei de Rava Rav Ashi, why is that a question? Now, right, V'chol hakol lechatchila. What do you mean hakol means everyone can do it? Is that true when the Mishnah says everyone can do something, it means they are allowed to or encouraged to do it? Is that really correct? Elamiyata, what about the Mishnah that starts Masechet Temura, which we'll have in 6 months or so, or maybe more, 8 months? It says hakol memirim. Everyone can do Temura. Remember, Temura is the process where you take an animal that's Kodshim, called animal A, and you stand up an animal next to it and say, I want the Kedusha to transfer from A to B. And the Torah says you're not allowed to do that. And if you do it, the Kedusha doesn't transfer, but it goes to both animals, right? So both A and B become Kodesh. But the Mishnah says everyone can do that process. Echad hanashim, ve'echad hanashim. Here it means men and women. And so what do you think, Rav Ashi? That means you're allowed to do Tmura? But the Torah very explicitly says, Lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiro tov bara rabitov. Don't do tamura. Don't switch an animal, a good for a bad or a bad for a good. So obviously, when the Mishnah says everyone can do tamura, it doesn't mean everyone's allowed to do tamura. It means that if you do tamura, it's effective. So why do you have a question here about our Mishnah of Hakol Shochadin implying everyone can do shchita? Answers Rav Ashi, well, that Mishnah is very clearly different because you didn't read the next words in the Mishnah. Hatam kiditani tama. There, the Mishnah continues and explains what it's talking about because it says, and now it's a quote from the Mishnah, Lo shaha adam rashai lahamir, not to say that a person's allowed to make a tremura, elashim hamir, but if you do the act, mumar, the animal becomes a tmura, meaning your words are amazingly able to affect this tmura. V'sofeget arba'im, and then you get 40 makot because you were over a lotase. When we get to tmura, we'll discuss how you can be over a lotase without action, with only words. Right? That's going to be a very big discussion. But the bottom line is that clearly that Mishnah of Hakol Memirim is not saying everyone's allowed to do tmura. The words continue and say, don't do it. So that's not relevant, right? So that's Rav Ashi's answer. Ella, so Rav Acha Brei Rava continued. What about the Mishnah in the beginning of Erechin? Right? So remember Erechin, which we're going to have also at the end of Kachim, is this process by which a person can dedicate the value of another person. Right? And remember that you can talk about someone's damim, which is their value, which is their market value. If they sell diamonds, as the Mishnah says, then they're very valuable. If they're a diamond cutter, not a seller. But Erechin means a fixed value that the Torah provides, which the pasuk talks about based on age and gender, right? So a male who's above the age of 20 is 50 shekel. A one who's above the age of 5 is something else. And so Erechin is fixed based on the person's age and whether they're a man or a woman, right? And there the Mishnah says in the beginning of Erechin, Hakol Marichin. Everybody, including men and women and others, can make the value, can commit to give the value of somebody else or nerachim, or they can be the object of that, meaning I can commit to give your value of a man or a woman or a child or whatever. And no dream, any dream. You can make a neder, right, which says I'm going to give a gift of a car, $10,000 to the Beit HaMikdash. And nidar, I could be the object, meaning someone comes into me and says, I'll give your value as a gift. So the bottom line is that the Mishnah says, this is a Mishnah in the beginning of Erechin, that everybody can do this, which according to you, Rav Ashi, implies that it's lechatchila, that everybody is encouraged to do this, right? And hachanami de lechatchila, is that true that it's lechatchila, you're allowed to do it, meaning that you are basically, there's no limitation on you doing Erechin and Nidarim. Hachtiv, but we have a pasuk, if you recall, in Dvarim, which says, "V'chi techadal lindar lo yeh b'chachet." If you don't make any nidarim, if you stop making nidarim, you won't come to sins, which implies, we'll see in a bright in a second, that we discourage people from making nidarim, right? Because if you make a neder, it's one step away from violating your neder, right? Because if you don't do it, that's a big sin. So it's better just to say nothing. And in fact, there's a pasuk in Kohelet which says that, Tova shelo tidar tidar v'lo tishalem. It's much better to never promise something than to promise it and not pay up, right? And Tanya, the Braita expands on that, and the Braita quotes this pasuk in Kohelet, which says, Tov, it's better not to make a neder. It says the Braita, 4 lines from the bottom of Bet Amud Aleph, Tov mizeh u'mizeh she'eino noder kol ikar, divrei Rabbi Meir. The best thing, right? It's one thing to make a neder and pay. It's one thing to make a neder and not pay. But the best thing is to never make a neder to begin with, because then you never get into trouble. So that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. So you see from Rabbi Meir, right, that you can do Erechin and Neder, but you're not supposed to. It's not encouraged. So when the Mishnah says Hakol Mimirim, right, it doesn't Hakol Nerachim, Marichin v'Nerachim, it doesn't mean you should do it. It means you could, right? And now continue the Braita. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees a little bit. Rabbi Yehuda says, actually it's a good thing to make Nidarim if you pay them up, right? Tov mizeh noder mishalem. That it's better, actually, if you're going to pay, it's a good thing to make a neder because you're giving God or giving the Beit HaMikdash something. But even Rabbi Yehuda, who says you should make a neder in some circumstances, I feel Rabbi Yehuda, lo kamer el ba'omer harezu. It's only if you say, I want to give this object, remember that's what we called nidava before, you turn the page, where you say, I'm going to give my cow Betsy to the Beit HaMikdash. And there it's not as big a risk because if something happens to that cow and it dies or it gets sick or it gets lost, you don't have to do anything because that was all you committed. But aval, if you say Hamer Hare Alai, lo, if you just make a personal commitment, I'm going to accept on myself to give something. Even Rabbi Yehuda says that's a terrible idea because it's a personal commitment that you have to fulfill. And if you don't, you're going to, or as Miriam was very worried about last week, if you can't afford it, right? So there's no way out of that, right? You basically have a personal commitment that you might not be able to keep. So that's a bad idea. And so therefore, says let me get the names wrong. Rav Acha Brei Rava to Rav Ashi. Clearly, when the Mishnah in Erechin says Hakol Marichim v'Nerachim, it doesn't mean everyone should do it. It means if they do it, it's okay. So your question, Rav Ashi, in our Mishnah is not a good question because when the Mishnah said Hakol Shochatin, I would not have read that to say everyone is encouraged to do shchita. It's lechatchila because the Mishnah might say that, and it only means b'diavad that if you shecht, it's okay. Says Rav Ashi now, or the Gemara at least speaking for Rav Ashi, but is that really true? Does hakol not mean sometimes at least that it's encouraged? V'chol hakol lav lechatchila? Are you telling me that every time it says hakol, it doesn't mean you should do it that way? What about the Mishnah and Sukkah? El hakol chayavim b'sukkah. Right? What does that mean according to you? That if you make a sukkah, it's okay. No, it means you have to make a sukkah. Or hakol chayavim b'tzitzit. You have to put on tzitzit. Ella says, well, that's not a question. Right? Hachanami, sorry, before I'll read the question. Third line. Is it true that that does not mean you have to do that? Says the Gemara on the fourth line. Well, those Mishnayot are not relevant because there it uses the word chayavim. Right? Chayavim means you must do it. So obviously there the Mishnah is saying you have to do this thing. Right? Chayavim lo ka'amina. I didn't ask them when it says chayavim. Our Mishnah just says hakol shochatin. So I don't know if hakol shochatin means everyone should do shchita, meaning we encourage it. It's lechatchila, every person has a responsibility. Or if it means b'diavad, if you do it, it's okay. Ella says, well, let's come up with another case. Me'ata, there's another Mishnah, which we had, of course, in Menachot, actually, recently. It said, Hakol somchim. Everyone does smicha on an animal, right? Remember, we had talked about the smicha at the end of Menachot. Echad ha-nashim ve'echad ha-nashim. Men and women. Now, what does that mean? Hakol somchim. Does it mean lechatchila or b'diavad? Does it mean you should do smicha, or does it mean you could do smicha? If you do it, it's okay. So you are now claiming, right, Rav Acha Brei Rava, that hakol does not mean lechatchila. It means you could do it. Hachanami, you're going to say delav lechatchila, that it doesn't mean you have to do it. But the pasuk clearly says you should. It says v'samach yadov v'nirtzah, right? So clearly, when it says hakol somchim, it means everyone has to do smicha. So again, it's not clear to me. You proved a couple times that hakol does not mean everyone has to do it. But I'm just proving to you a time where hakol does mean everyone has to do it. And answers the Gemara what you would have expected,
Eli, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
The echad nashim. What does the word echad add there? Could you say anashim v'nashim, right?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. Sometimes the Mishnah uses that language. I don't have a more elegant answer though. Well, thank you. But Ella says the Gemara now, 7, 8 lines to the top. Hakol dehacha. Oh, sorry, where am I? Sorry, I skipped a line. We're 2, 4, 6, 7 lines from the 6 lines from the top. In the last word on the line. The answer is yes, meaning it's complex. Ika hakol lechatchila, v'ika hakol diavad. Sometimes hakol means lechatchila, and sometimes hakol means diavad. So now let's go back to where we started our Gemara today. Where Rav Ashi, I'm going to say it's Rav Ashi because it's clear from the Gemara it was Rav Ashi. The Gemara just said stam, and many bring from here one of the sources that Rav Ashi is the author of the Gemara. But the Gemara said, how does our Mishnah make any sense? It says hakol shochatim, which implies lechatchila, you're supposed to do it, and then it says if you shecht, it's kosher, which implies b'diavad. Says the Gemara, if hakol can mean both, why are you assuming it means lechatchila and asking a question? Assume it means b'diavad and don't ask a question. So what's your question, Rav Ashi? Ella, this is the question, right? Hakol dahacha. Oh, I'm going to speak. This I just spoke out what the Gemara is about to say. Here in our Mishnah, when it says hakol, mimayda lechatchilahu detikshi. How do you know, Rav Ashi, that hakol shochatin means lechatchila, and then your question was, it's a contradiction, right? Dilma diavadu v'lo tikshi. Maybe hakol in our Mishnah means everyone who does shchita, it's okay, not that they should do it, and then you have no question from the next words in the Mishnah, which imply b'diavad. Amar Leis Rav Ashi answered Rav Acha Brei Rava and said, you misunderstood me. My question was not from the word hakol shochatin. Ana shchitatan kshera kashli. My problem was from the second clause in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says hakol shochatin, which could mean either b'diavad or lechatchila. But then it says, V'im avad, if you shechted, shchitatan kshera, right? The second clause in the Mishnah. And that is clearly b'diavad. If you do it, it's okay. But midiktani shchitatan kshera diavad, right? From the fact that it said, if you do it, it's kosher, it clearly implies diavad. But michlal, then I would go back to the first words of the Mishnah and say, the hakol must be lechatchilahu. That the first part of the Mishnah of hakol must mean sometimes you can do it, where you're allowed to do it, and sometimes you're not allowed to, but if you do it, it's okay, right? Now, just to be clear, we have to clarify, which we haven't done yet, what circumstances are lechatchila and what circumstances are b'diavad, right? So we haven't added that yet. That's our next question, right? But Rav Ashi is saying, clearly to me, the Mishnah is saying two different categories of people. Because if it wasn't, di avad tarti di avad lamali. If the Mishnah was saying bidi avad, it's okay. Why do you need to say it twice? Why is hakol shochatin bidi avad and shchitatan kshera is also bidi avad? So clearly, from the fact that we have two different descriptions of how you do shchita, there are two categories of who can do shchita. That was Rav Ashi's question, and that's a great question, right? And I'll go back and say it in a way that would have saved us the last 20 minutes, but not taught us all the Gemara we just learned. Why do you have two descriptions of shchita, right? The Mishnah says, Hakol shochatin, everyone can do shchita, and then it says, and where am I? Hakol shochatin, and then it says the word shchitatan kshera, and if you do shchita, it's kosher. So when is it lichatchila, you're allowed to do it, and when is it b'diavad, that if you're not supposed to do it, but if you do it, it's okay. So that was Rav Ashi's question. We finally are ready to get to the answer of the question, and we are a third of the way down on Daf Bet Amud Bet. Says Rabba Bar Ula, Hachi Katani. This is the way you have to understand our Mishnah. Hakol shochatin means everyone can do shchita, men and women and avadim, etc. We'll get to that later. But the point is, even a person who's tamei, who's shechting chullin, can do shchita, lichatchila, right? Obviously, by kodshim, we have all kinds of worries about tumah. You're not allowed to be tamei when you do shchita. You're not allowed to make a carbon tamei, right? But by chullin, no problem. You could be tamei, you can do shchita. That's what our Mishnah is telling you. Now, says the Gemara, 1 second. Tamei b'chullin ma'ila meimra. Why is that a chiddush? Whoever imagined in what world would there be a problem doing shchita if you're tamei? There's no concept. No one has ever heard of those words. So why does the Mishnah need to come and tell me you can do shchita even if you're tamei? It's like saying you can do shchita even if, I don't know, even if you're wearing a bracelet. It's irrelevant, right? Why would tuma matter for shchita? Says where, well, it's true that for regular chulin, it doesn't matter. But there is a category called, where am I? B'chulin shenasu al taharat hakodesh. There's a category of people who do chulin as if they're doing kodesh. What does that mean? Rashi here gives a nice explanation, but elsewhere he says other things or other ideas. That basically a person, Rashi here's example is that he's a person who's going to bring a carbon, right? A shlamim or a toda, Rashi says, like a voluntary carbon. And he's preparing. It's like you're getting ready for Pesach, right? So when you go to the Beit HaMikdash, maybe you teach your family, you're going to have to stay tahar. You can't do shchita if you're tamei. You can't eat the meat if you're tamei. So we're going to practice, and we're going to do tumah free for the next 2 weeks, right, in our house. And so we're going to do what's called chulin al taharat kodesh. We're going to play or act with chulin as we would with kodesh. Right? And so you might have thought that if you're actually, and which maybe people did all the time, if you're committing to living that way, that maybe you should be very careful not to do that if you're tamei, right? Because you're not allowed to make the meat tamei. Says the Mishnah, no problem. You can do it. Now, what about making the meat tamei? So obviously, you're going to have to use a long knife, right? You can't touch the animal if you're tamei. But if you're not touching the animal, you're just touching the knife, there's no problem. There's no concern. So let's read that inside. Chullin shenasu al taharat kodesh kikodesh dami, right? The kasavar, we hold that chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh kikodesh dami. That if you're acting with chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh, you should treat it like kodesh. Ketzad hu oseh. So what should you do if you want to do shchita? Mevi sakin aruka v'shochet. You bring a long knife, get a 3-foot long knife, which sounds pretty long, and you can't touch the animal, and you do the shchita. Obviously, someone else would have to hold the animal down, or they'd have to have like the cages they have now, but whatever, you would figure it out. So that is permitted lechatchila, right? As long as you don't touch the animal, right? So you should use a long knife, yigaba basar. So that's what the Mishnah is saying. Hakol shochatin, meaning if you're tamei, even if you're using your meat al taharat kodesh, it's not a problem to shecht if you're tamei. However, ubemuktashim lo yishchot. But if you're actually talking about a carbon, right, even though in theory you could do the same thing with a carbon, you could stand outside the Beit HaMikdash with a long knife, reach the knife inside and shech the animal. But we very strongly discourage that. Why? K'shema yigabe basar. Because then you might touch the meat. And remember, if you touch a carbon and it becomes tamei, you're over at Isser Doraita. That's a big deal. But continues the Mishnah, however, although you're not supposed to do that, im shachat, if you do shecht an animal that's kudshim and you're tamei, v'omer, and you can testify, bari li shelo nagati, I know that I didn't touch the animal, then shchita to kshira. Then your shchita is kshira. So basically what the Mishnah is saying is a very complex and seemingly, out of the blue kind of case, saying that if you're tamei and you're doing chulin, right, then even if you're doing chulin al tarat kodesh, meaning you're treating your chulin like it's kachim, no problem. You can shecht if you're tummy, right? Just use a long knife. But if it's kachim, you shouldn't shecht. But if you did it b'diavad and you can testify and say I didn't touch it, then it's kodesh. It's kosher. Yes, Charlie, your hand.
What about the requirement for smicha?
So
You
smicha,
have to touch the animal.
yeah. So you would not be able to do smicha if you were tamei. Remember, you could. There are different carbonot, of course, but yes, obviously you couldn't do smicha. It's a good question.
So what would you get out of like just doing the shechita?
So a couple. I mean, first of all, it could be that you'll become Torah that night, right? And then you could eat the meat. It's not right. Let's say it's a shlamim and you're tamei. You can do the shechita, stand outside, and then that night when you become tahar, you'll be able to eat the animal. Or the next day, shlamim could be 2 days, right? So you have even more time. By a toda, for example,
And you can testify on your own behalf that it's kosher?
that's a really good question, but the answer so far is yes. Tomorrow we're going to get into more of this big question about how
Oh, you always make me try to tune in tomorrow.
So if you come tomorrow, 7:45. But the answer is yes. I mean, the bottom line is, so the truth is we're going to see all this, but for most of shechita, it's not so observable, right? We're going to see in a second. One of the problems with shechita is you're not allowed to slow down the knife while you're doing it. It's really hard for others to see you doing that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can't even imagine like you using a long knife. I mean, it's a very precise type of like thing to do.
Well, first of all, the Gemara has very far-fetched cases, so let's start with that.
Yeah, that
Obviously.
we know.
We know that. But in theory, someone would have to immobilize the animal, right? Obviously, you're not going to get it from an animal that's 3 feet away from you.
Right, but exactly. If you use a knife that is super long, it's like you can't even see the exact spot that you're supposed to like, shecht. So I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
It wouldn't have to be that long if they brought the animals to the gate and you were right outside the
it
gate.
would have to be something. It'd be 2 feet, let's say, right? But correct. Anyway, so that is the first two cases in our Mishnah. The third clause in our Mishnah was, which we're up to now, halfway down, chutz micher shotev v'katan. This is except for a cher shotev v'katan. Now, what are we excluding a cher shotev v'katan from? Da afilo b'chulin greda diavad namilo. Cher shotev v'katan, you cannot forget about tuma. They can't even shecht a regular animal. Why don't we let a person who we don't think is capable of intelligence shechting a regular animal? Because we worry, now we're going to get to a next parak, actually, not tomorrow, the many different things you have to do when you do shechita. There are 5 requirements of shechita, but we're worried that a katan is not going to be smart enough, or a cherish or shota, to do shechita properly, and Shema, where am I? Shema diavad namilo, because even b'diavad it's not kosher. Because Shema yishu, maybe they will slow down, they'll delay while they're doing shechita. We're going to see you're supposed to do it in one action. If you stop in the middle and then continue, that's a problem. Obviously, we'll have to define how long stopping is a problem because you're always stopping, instantaneously. And Shema yidrusu literally means to trample something, right? And so remember, shechita is supposed to be a cutting action, not a pressure action. And so, which of course are very different, very difficult to disentangle those two, right? But we don't want you putting pressure on the windpipe and the jugular of the animal. We want you cutting across it. A katan may not realize he doesn't know he's pushing too hard. Shema yachalidu. Now, yachalidu means that you literally, I think you get in between, right? You get a chulda, which means that you go underneath. Chulda is an animal that burrows under the ground. Chulda is like a weasel, I think we translate usually. But anyways, it's you might burrow underneath, and we're going to see later that you're supposed to cut from the outside. But if you stick the knife inside, basically the animal, and then cut from the middle, that's a problem. Again, we'll get to all these cases. But by a katan, we're worried, a katan shecher shotav katan, that they're going to do it wrong. So even if they say they did it right, it's b'diavad puzzle. So that's the third clause in the Mishnah.
But it sounded from the Mishnah, the way you introduced it, that part of the issue was that they wouldn't have the proper intent. It wasn't even about the technicality of how they were going to be doing it.
So I wouldn't say it's intent, that they don't know how to do it. Right? The Mishnah said Shema yikalkulu et shchitatan. They might mess it up. So again, mess it up could be philosophically or mentally or physically. Yeah. We're interpreting it as physical. But then the next words are what confuse you probably. So Gemara is now about to analyze. The fourth clause in the Mishnah was kulan sheshachatu. I don't know where it is, but I'm somewhere here. Yeah, you're right. The anyone who does shchita, ahai. So what's that referring to? Right? Because the fourth clause in the Mishnah was everyone who does shchita and someone else is watching them, it's kosher. So what's that referring to? Is it referring to the katan, that what Miriam just said, that maybe in fact the katan could do shchita if someone is supervising them, right? Ahai, what's that referring to? Well, then alakai, then you're talking about the same issue. Why are you reintroducing it? Just continue and say, vim shachatu, if they do shchita and someone else watches them, they'll be okay. So why start over, right? You start with the word kulan. And anybody who does this, if you're talking about the previous case, you just have to say, if they do it, not if anyone. So it clearly is not talking about that case, right? Ella, it's referring to the first case, meaning it's going back a tamei b'chulin, right? It's going back to the first case where you said in the Mishnah that a tamei person is allowed to do chulin, even chulin al taharat hakodesh. And the Mishnah says, and if someone watches them and they therefore know that they didn't touch it, then it's kosher. But says we already said the problem is fixed by the person saying I didn't touch it. So what do you need someone else watching them? Right? You said that if it's chulin, you can check lechatchila. You don't need someone watching you. Ella atamei b'muktashim. If it's talking about tuma, a tamei person shechting a karban, right? So we said you don't need someone watching them. Bibari lisagi. If the person says I know I didn't touch the animal and make it tamei, that's enough. So what do you need somebody else watching them? Answers the Gemara if the person's not there. Dileta, come on, dinashayle, right? If the person is not there to ask them. So someone shechted a karban in the morning, right? Later in the day, maybe you found out that person was tamei, let's just say, and we don't have that person to say to them, did you touch the animal? So then we rely on outside supervision, which is going to get us into a long discussion about when you rely on outside supervision, right? We'll get there tomorrow. But then you rely on the person watching them to say, we did not see them touch the animal, or we saw that they didn't touch the animal. And then it would be kosher, even though the shochet is tamei, as long as somebody watched and said they didn't touch the animal. So that is the halacha of the Mishnah. So we now understand our Mishnah. This is where it's wonderful. It's a great Mishnah. But everyone who learned Daf Yomi knows that in Zvachim we had almost identical Mishnah. Ask the Gemara, is the source that a person who's tamei can shech the karban if they use a long knife? Is that from this Mishnah in Chullin? We already know this from another Mishnah in Zvachim. The Mishnah said in Zvachim, Kol apsulin sheshachatu. Everyone who's puzzle for a kohen, for a karban, for things like that, who does shchita tan kshera. They are allowed to do shchita. And this is the Mishnah. Shchita kshera bizarim, a non-kohen, binashim, bavadim, ubitmeim. So the Mishnah in Zvachim already said very clearly that you could be tamei and do shchita. Obviously, you can't touch the animal. You'd have to use a long knife, right? So afilo, and the Mishnah continues, afilo b'kachei kadashim, ubevad shlo yetmeim nogim b'basar, right? Even a kachei kadashim, if you have a long enough knife, you can do, and you just can't touch the meat, the animal. So why does our Mishnah need to say this if it's already said in Zvachim? Answers the Gemara, you're right, it's repetitive. But hacha ikar, this is the main source to talk about shchita. This is Masechet Chullin, Shchitat Chullin, where we talk about how you do shchita. Hatam, over there in Zvachim, Aidi the Tana Sharp Sulim, Tananami Tamei B'Muktashim. Because we're listing all the other cases, which are not relevant in our Mishnah, Zar, a woman, an Eved. So therefore we added on this case. It's true, but it was repetitive, but it's necessary, or the main source is our Mishnah in Chullin. Or Ibai Tema, you can look at it the other way. We're 4 lines from the bottom. Hatamikar, maybe actually that's the main place, because in Zvachim you're talking about Kachim. So it makes a lot of sense to be Kachim Kai. But Hacha here, our main focus is on not Kachim. But Aindi Ditana Tamei Bechulin, since we start talking about a person who's Tamei doing Chulin, Hachanami, Taninami Tamei B'Muktashim. Okay, so the answer is it is repetitive, One of them is the main source. One of them is a agav, a secondary source, and it's okay. We can do that. We can handle that. So it doesn't stop us. So that is now our Mishnah. Now, before we're going to do a few more lines because it is still early. Ask the Gemara the question, which I'm sure has been bothering everybody. I appreciate that no one jumped out and said it, which is, what about if the person's tamei, then does the knife become tamei, right? So if a person is tamei and they take a knife to shecht an animal, the knife becomes tamei and then the animal becomes tamei. So how does it help to take a knife if you're tamei and shecht an animal? So ask the Gemara 2 lines on the bottom. Hi tamei itzma b'mai. When we say the person who's tamei can shecht an animal as long as they don't touch it, what kind of tumah does that person have? Right? Now, we have a minute and I'll do it. Remember, tumah, there's different categories of tumah, different levels of tumah, right? So a dead body is called avi avota tumah, a grandfather, granddaddy of all tumah, right? A person who touches a dead body or is in an ohel, in a tent with a dead person, becomes one level down. They become an av hatumah, all right? A father of tumah, a high level. If they touch something, we'll see what exactly, that thing becomes a rishon l'tumah, okay? In theory, if a rishon touches, it becomes a sheni or shlishi or revi. Now, as we recall, we learned, I don't know who was part of DAF back then, but a lot of this already, in some things in kachim, you have more status than in truma and more than in maaser and more than in chullin. So there's different levels. But the basic level, and this is very basic, but I'm going to say it, and attack me if you don't agree, is that the only things that make tumah in a person or an object are av hatuma, meaning a rishon l'tumah. So if a person touches a dead body, they're an av hatuma. If they then touch another person or a bowl or whatever, that thing becomes a rishon l'tumah. But a rishon l'tumah does not make anything else tamei, nor does a person who's a rishon l'tumah. Right, so if a person touched another a person who touched a dead person, right? So a tamei mate who's an avatuma touched a rishon, and that rishon touches someone else or an object, it does not become tamei. So the only things that make people and objects tamei are av hatuma, not rishon l'tuma. You could become a rishon, but then you can't pass it on. The exception to that is food, right? So food is an exception. Food and drink is a big exception where and rishon can make food and drink further tamei, right? So in theory, if a person is an avatuma because they touched a dead body and they touch a knife, that knife becomes a rishon l'tuma. If the rishon l'tuma touches an animal, that animal's food and it becomes tamei, right? But if that knife touches, I don't know, a scarf, that scarf does not become tamei. Okay, so that's the background of tuma. Now says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom, Hi tamei itzme b'mai. When this person is shechting the animals tamei, how are they, meaning what made them tamei? Ilema itzme b'meit. If you're talking about, I guess maybe a common case where a person was in an ohel in a room or touched a dead body. So I don't think then it doesn't help you, says the Gemara, to take the knife and shech the animal, because now Rashi points out here, before I do the Gemara, that the simple question is, if you're an avatuma and you take a knife, it becomes a rishon, and then it makes the animal tamei, right? So that's a problem on its own. But it says the Gemara, we have an even bigger problem, because there's a special halacha that when you have metal that touches a person who's an avatuma, it actually doesn't go down a level. It stays the same level. And that's based on a pasuk. The pasuk says, B'chalal cherev. With the corpse, you have a knife. And we learn from there, Amar Rachmana, cherev, top of Daf Gimel, cherev harehu kichalal. That the knife, or the sword in this case, right, where you killed someone with, actually has the tuma status of the corpse itself. Meaning, if a person kills another person with a knife, the knife does not become one level down from the mate. It's the same level as the mate. It's avi avota tuma. And so in theory, if a man who's a rishon l'tuma took a knife and shechted an animal, the knife would become if a man is an avatuma, the knife would stay in avatuma, right? So hareu kichalal, avatumahu, if the person is an avatuma because they're tamei mate, litzmaya l'sakin, they will make the sakin tamei as an avatuma, va'azo sakin mitzimite lebatzar. And then the knife that you use to shech the animal, even though you didn't touch the animal, the knife carries your tuma and makes the basar tamei. Right? So how in the world would a person who's tamei mate be able to shecht an animal even with a long knife? Answers tomorrow, you're right. You couldn't. Ella, it's Maya b'sheretz. We're talking about a case where the person became tamei by touching a sheretz. If you become tamei by touching a sheretz, you become an avatuma, right? Sorry, you become a rishon l'tuma. Take it back. You become rishon l'tuma, and therefore, when you touch the knife, you don't make the knife tamei, right? Because you only do it with an av. Yes, Charlie. Before I do the ibai tema.
Why not a knife with a stone handle? Stone can't become tummy.
Says
Or
the
for that matter, a stone knife.
answers the Gemara v'ibay tema, or else you can say lo'olam di'itma b'meit tegon shebadak krumit shokana, where you use, this case is a little better than your case, but it's the same answer. You used actually not a
I didn't read ahead.
knife, but you used a reed, right? You used a sharpened piece of wood, basically. That's not, remember, if you make it into a kli, it becomes tameh. This has to be pshutei kliates, basically, right? So you use basically a natural occurring thing that you checked, and you have to check and make sure it doesn't have any cuts in it. Remember, we're going to talk about checking knives later, but you have to make sure there's no nicks in the knife because it might grab the trachea of the animal. But you checked the reed and shachatbo, and you checked it with that thing. Titania, as we're going to learn in a Braita later, ba kol shochatim, you can check with anything, bein bitzur, which is really Charlie's case, right? Whether you're using a flint or a piece of rock, which is not going to be tameh, bein bischulchit, whether you're using glass, bein bikrumit shokana, or even if you're using a reed. So it's
Sorry, I didn't look ahead.
No, it's great. You learned this before, I think. So, but the second answer is, as Charlie proposed, that you use something which is not mikabel tuma, and therefore, although you're tameh, it doesn't pass on, and as long as you don't touch the animal, you don't make the animal tameh. And so that is another method that you can potentially do shchita, even of a kachim, although you're tameh. We do not encourage that. L'chatchila, you're not supposed to do that, right? Because there's so much potential to touch it. But b'diavad, if you did it and you verify that you didn't touch the animal, or if you're not there, but there were witnesses who can say, we saw him and he didn't touch the animal, then it is kosher shchita. And tomorrow,
I just realized something else. I asked about smicha. Live animals can't become tummy. So smicha
Right,
would not be an issue.
correct, you are correct. It would only be the shchita, correct.
Yeah, so I retract my question from earlier.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Shashakoch, everyone. Welcome to the new Masechta. Hopefully, we'll see you all tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. to continue this discussion, especially about who can be mashkiach on top of this. Yasher koach all.
Thank you.
So,
I have a scheduling conflict tomorrow morning, but I'll catch your recording.
Okay, we'll see you next week. I'll see you next
I'm
week.
going to a funeral. I'll be probably
Please.
on a bus when the
Okay, well,
so I'm still going to try to
take what we get.
log in.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.